Hi everyone, I am Daniel, and this is the start of a new series here on my channel. It's all about deck building in Arkham Horror, the card game. But in order to talk about deck building, I think you need to start with what you're going to be building that deck as part of a team. I've been playing a lot of true solo here on my channel recently, and it's easy to think about deck building when you're the only investigator that's playing the game, but that actually has taught me a lot about what you need across the whole team. So, we're going to start talking about deck building with team building, really. And to talk about team building, we need to zoom out even further and start with what exactly the game expects you to do. What is this game really all about? To progress the game, you need to advance the act. That's that deck of cards, hopefully somewhere in the front of your table, that is telling you what you're supposed to do, your objectives. We're going to go over in a second what the different objectives generally are, but that's what you need to do. On the flip side, the game expects that you're going to not lose the game too. And that often happens by dooming out, that is, progressing through the agenda deck, or getting defeated through some other means, taking too much damage or horror, basically. Now, if you want to do extra beyond just the goals that are stated on the act, you probably are going to get some victory points for that, and you're expected to do as much of that as you can, but it's somewhat optional. A lot of scenarios have this mechanic of do as much as you can, and that tends to be rewarded with things like extra victory points. So you're expected to do these things. Let's talk about advancing the act a little bit more, and we'll talk more about the second two things as well. The most common way to advance the act is to spend clues. There's usually a little number printed in the bottom right about how many clues you need to spend. This happens maybe even more than once per scenario, sometimes up to 3. It gives you a threshold of how many clues you need to get. It's usually scaling by the number of players as well. Sometimes there's other ways to spend clues. You need to spend them in a particular location. That's why the second bullet point here is about opening up different locations. You're supposed to go around the map and open up different locations and see what there is, a little bit of exploration. The other thing that you might need to do to advance the act is to take some scenario tests. You might need to parlay with particular different NPC on the board. Maybe you need to do some other things that require you to take some flat scenario tests, like willpower, agility, those sorts of things that might be printed somewhere on the board. That can help you advance the act. That's sometimes has to be you spending clues to do that as well, sometimes not. So there can be some combinations of these different criteria. And lastly, this is kind of the least likely, is to defeat some kind of boss or maybe a mini boss somewhere in the middle of the scenario. This requires you, of course, to do some damage. You can't get away with just evasion for bosses. You just actually have to deal a bunch of damage. Sometimes there's other ways to defeat them, usually by spending clues, but this is the least common. Even though this is in the very first scenario of the game, and then there is a kind of mini boss in the second scenario of the game, very few scenarios in the rest of the campaigns actually have this as a act advancement. Sometimes there's a mini boss that sits around or is in the encounter deck for you to get extra victory points, but they're often not something you need to do. So this is why we often talk about this game being so clue oriented, because it's the most common thing you need to do. So how do you advance the act? You have to focus your decks on and your team on getting clues. That's the most important thing you can do. Now, how many clues that is varies, and I'll get back to that in a second. If you're going to be opening up locations, you should have some way to move around the board. This might just be the basic move action, but if you're moving a lot because it's a bigger map, you might need some more tools to do that. Now, as far as taking scenario tests goes, again, this is for act advancement. There's other reasons to take scenario tests to avoid treacheries and whatnot, but you'll need to cover different skills. It's not just, for example, all combat skills or all investigation skills. Those are used for these other things on the list here. Sometimes you need to use your other skills to pass tests to progress the act. Otherwise, you might be sitting there and just sort of spinning your wheels if you can't pass some of these tests that you're maybe not as good at. Particularly true in true solo. Let's go back to the earlier list about the things the game expects you to do. It expects you to go quickly enough. And that's part of what don't doom out really means. It's you can do all the things that the act deck wants you to do if you had an infinite amount of time, but what this game really is about is doing it efficiently and quickly enough. Number one way to do this is to get action compression. Now, for dealing with enemies, it's very obvious that you use weapons of some sort in order to deal multiple points of damage to enemies at once. So instead of just taking basic fights and dealing one damage at a time, which would be very, very slow and potentially dangerous, you can use weapons to do more than one damage at a time and get through much more quickly. But like I said, dealing with enemies doesn't necessarily progress the act all the time. So what about getting clues? What kinds of ways can we get action compression for getting clues? I have a whole video about action compression, so I'm not going to get into this any more than I have to, but there are lots of assets and events that get more than one clue at once, so that can help you move through those acts quicker. There's other ways to do this, though. There's something called just getting extra actions altogether, giving yourself more time. So if you have, say, Leo DeLuca in play, it's a rogue ally that just flat out gives you more turn, then you can take your time, as it were, to get through the acts. You don't need as much action compression when you can have more time to do your basic actions. Now, you can do both, and that's even better. You want to do as much of this stuff as possible, and combining all of these is a good idea. I say or similar as well, because there's cards that will give you something that's the equivalent of an extra action. Whether that's something like a shortcut that gives you a free move, or maybe you have something else in play that just deals damage or gets clues without spending actions, that all kind of factors in the same idea. Third thing on our list of not going too slowly is to reduce your setup time. If your first turn is just playing a bunch of cards, that's probably fine. You need to, set up your assets so you can pass those tests that you're getting clues on, so you're not wasting time failing things, right? Failing is a way to lose a lot of your pace of game on action compression especially. So it's fine to take some time setting up, but you can't do that forever. The game is going to have some pressure on you, especially as a fighter. You can't waste your time just drawing cards, finding your weapons. You need to have a good enough density of weapons in your deck to be ready as soon as you can to deal with the challenges of the scenario. The nice thing about clues, of course, is that they're kind of just there. They don't really go away. More on that later. But you still don't want to spend lots of your turns not progressing the game. And the fourth thing is avoiding team waste. And it's kind of a funny way of putting this, but especially when you have more than one, well, necessarily when you have more than one player, one challenge you have to overcome is you can't just follow around all of your other players. You can't just, as your fighter, take actions to move in and out of locations when you really didn't need to, right? The best thing, of course, in a larger group is that you're able to fan out across the map and not have to have everyone move as a giant blob, wasting so many actions just moving around. You also want to have the right people in the right place. So this isn't necessarily just about movement. There's other things as well, but acting efficiently as a team can also mean, right now, the scenario requires us to do lots of clue getting. And if one of your investigators can't get any clues, they might not just sit there and twiddle their thumbs. Maybe there's actually something they could do about this. And that has a lot to do with your investigator choices and your deck building too. Scenario by scenario, of course, this is going to change, but you also don't want to have a turn where there's too many enemies and you couldn't deal with them. And now whoever is engaged with an enemy and can't get rid of them, how are they going to get out of this problem, right? The team waste there is that, do they just pass on their actions and not do anything because you couldn't defeat all the enemies in time? This is a challenge. All right, let's move on to not getting defeated. And this often is what's going to be the pressure from the encounter deck itself. The biggest one, of course, is just drawing enemies. You don't want to have enemies attack you, right? That's going to slow you down, of course, if they're engaged with you and you can't get rid of them. They're also going to deal you damage and horror and eventually kill you. So dealing with enemies, of course, is a very important one. And then the attacks, of course, is part of this. How you do this, variety of ways, defeating them, evading them, whatever it might be. You also want to pass or cancel tests on treacheries. So these will take away your turn as well. This is kind of a little bit of the previous one too, where you can lose actions or lose things in play that you already spent time and resources playing. So this is like dealing with the encounter deck is an important part of not getting defeated, but also kind of part of this don't go too slowly. Another way to deal with this, if you do take damage or whatnot, is that you have to have some way of passing on that damage or horror to other assets in play. That's called soaking, or healing that damage or horror off of your important assets or off your investigator cards so you don't just die. This is a tricky one to figure out how much you really need to do this, because I put it under don't get defeated because it only matters if you get defeated. So you don't want to overdo this, but at the same time, it gives you some leeway where if you have a lot of damage and horror that you can soak, that allows you to play a little bit more recklessly later, maybe take some attacks of opportunity from enemies just to get to the end of the scenario. So it's a tricky one to have to deal with and think about, because it is potentially wasting your time, but it is something to keep in mind as well. In solo, as I've learned recently, you have to do everything. You have to soak all the damage and horror, you have to defeat all the enemies, you have to get all the clues, so your deck needs to do everything. Exactly how much of each of those tasks really does vary from scenario to scenario. And as an example, let's look at two first scenarios of two different campaigns. The first one is the Circle Undone. So we're looking here at the Witching Hour. And it's a very interesting scenario that has several different acts, and it first asks you to get 2 clues per investigator, then 1 per to advance the next act, then 3 per, and then the very last act asks you to either get another 3 per clues or defeat a 4 per health boss. You have a choice. And while clues are, something that you can kind of hold off on until you are ready to get them, these last 3 per clues don't really, you can't get them until the very end. So it's a little bit of a race to which thing you think you can do first. Now, the encounter deck itself is a little bit unusual. It only has 4 enemies in it to begin with, and out of 29 counter cards, that's only 14%. People often think that enemies are a huge challenge in this game, and they are, because they can stop you in your tracks, but the reality is the probability that you draw an enemy out of the encounter deck anyways is quite low. Now, some scenarios have enemies that come from some other places, and this one is one of those, that one enemy per player will show up partway through, and that comes from elsewhere. So you have to deal with that enemy too. Overall, you have about 14 to 16 rounds. It's hard to count in this particular scenario because there are some things about Doom that make it difficult to tell, but roughly you can say 14 to 16, maybe a little bit more depending on how things are going. So that means that if you want to do well in this scenario, every 3 rounds or so, you should get about 2 per clues and defeat like half an enemy, or at least deal with half of an enemy. At least that's true towards the beginning of the scenario. So we're talking about if you're doing solo, right, every 6 rounds you might run into 1 enemy, maybe on average. Of course, variance is part of the interest of this game, that you might draw all the enemies in the first couple of rounds, and then you're like, well, I guess my whole turn will be spent just dealing with enemies. So this pace, though, every 3 rounds getting 2 per clues, isn't all that bad. And again, these are rough estimates. The other scenarios in the same campaign, as you get through, the number doesn't really get that more onerous. You don't have to get more clues. Now, sometimes you might need to if you want to get extra victory points. More on that for the next scenario. So I would say this is a bare minimum, and you should strive for more than that. it's hard. We'll talk about this more in future videos about deck building. It's hard to sort of math out, okay, how do I get exactly that many clues? But we're kind of thinking about, um, you know, if in solo, this is less than a clue per round. And if you're averaging about that, then you're in a pretty good space. But remember, it's on average. You're going to have some turns where you just can't get any clues, and maybe the next round you can't get any clues either, but you're setting up in order to get yourself there. And maybe you have some enemies that kind of showed up and delayed. But later on, hopefully the variance swings the other way, and then you can start picking up the pace a lot more. So while sometimes if you're at a good pace early, that feels like you're doing very well, it may just be that you're going to run into a tougher spot later on. Let's compare this with the Pit of Despair. This is the first scenario of the Innsmouth Conspiracy, and this one has a different set of acts. First, you need to get 3 per clues, and then kind of another 3 per clues, and then you'll resign as the last thing. So you actually have to go to a particular location that you have to find in order to resign. So that's another, again, part of what you need to do. You need to move around a lot, especially in this scenario. Now, there are more clues on the board if you want to get additional goals, including victory points, but there's a few other things as well. Now, this encounter deck starts with quite a few more enemies than the one we just saw. This is a little bit more typical about the percentage of enemies in a deck. 9 out of 30 is about 30%. Usually it's somewhere between 25 and 30. Usually no more than that. Of course, this scenario also has a set aside enemy that pops up, and it's kind of hard to make this one go away forever. So you kind of can add one more to that mix, but it doesn't scale. Something we'll come back to later. The enemies and things that come out of the encounter deck, that is scaling for the number of players. The ones that aren't don't, so it kind of wrecks the math a little bit. This one has a lot more time also, and there's no I think it really is 19 Doom. There's no really possibility of that changing. So this one we can math out a bit better. We know that we need those 6 clues per investigator, plus a little bit more probably. So what we're looking at here is every 3 rounds you want about 1.5 clues per investigator, probably more than that. And you're going to have to probably defeat 1 enemy per investigator as well. So again, if you're playing 3-player, we're looking at there's probably going to be 3 enemies on the board every 3 rounds. Maybe that one round there's no enemies, but then the next round you get 2. So you have to keep in mind that sort of variance is very common in this game. That should clue into what am I preparing my decks to be able to do. I need to be able to deal with those rounds where things are really bad and not just assume that it'll be very quiet all the time. So how quickly do you need to get started? I mentioned this a little bit already, but you don't need to match the pace that I just brought up as long as you get there by the end, for the most part. And this means that some decks and some investigators are going to turtle a bit, where they just play all their stuff. They draw until they find the good cards that will help them get to getting all the clues on the board, maybe within a few rounds. So this is really maybe more restricted to clues than enemies, because those can pop up whenever, and you can't put that off. But to some extent, it's true about clues also, that you need to move around the board. You need to start opening things up to see what you're doing. With more scenario knowledge, when you replay campaigns, you can get away with, not moving places because you know what's there. But there are some locations that will, or treacheries even, that will require you to move or to do things across multiple rounds rather than doing it all at once. So there's sometimes some limits on your clue getting as well. But the most important reason why you should go as quickly as you can, at least if it's possible, is that the fewer rounds you play, the better. The fewer encounter cards you draw, the less likely treacheries or enemies will ruin your day, keep you from getting all of those clues. You don't want to be under a stack of enemies or treacheries when you're trying to do all of your stuff. And the quicker that you can go, the less likely you're going to run into trouble. The one downside for being very efficient and quick out of the gate is that you might run out of gas. That the reason why some decks and investigators and players try to take a beat and play all their stuff is because they need to in order to actually pass all of their tests and get all the clues they need. If they were going to try to investigate on turn one, they would just fail. And you can play decks that, can get out magnifying glasses very quickly, and that's all very well and good. But unless you can sustain that pace throughout the rest of the scenario, then you probably don't need to do that. It's better for you to be a little bit safer. But if you can, of course, going fast is good. So let's move on to building a team in general. And I'm going to start with this big question of, is playing 2-player or 3-player or 4-player just multiple solo decks at once? Because in some sense, the scaling in the game seems like it could be, right? Instead of needing to get, say, 9 clues, we need to get 18. Well, I'll get 9, you get 9, and it's basically like playing 2 solo decks. That's really not taking advantage, though, of how the game works. Specializing, meaning that I get maybe all 18 clues or some larger portion of the clues than I would be responsible for in solo, is probably better because you can focus your deck on being able to do that. You can be really good at it instead of trying to tackle multiple problems at once. I can just know that I can do enough clue getting for multiple people. So there's also a lot of things in this game that don't scale, right? So number of clues does, but the number of locations on the map doesn't. The number of bosses, for example, doesn't. And of course, things like the number of cards in your deck doesn't. I still only get to draw 5 cards at the beginning of the game, no matter how many players there are. And my ability to find, whatever I needed in that particular moment is much less when I'm trying to do everything, right? Solo has this problem of, well, this is what I drew. But if your deck, for example, had 30 weapons in it, right? You know that you're going to have a weapon in your opening hand, and you'll be ready to deal with enemies on turn 1. If you only had some lower percentage, like, 3 weapons or something, because you needed to do other things with your deck, you don't know if you're going to draw that thing. So specialization can take advantage of that lack of scaling. That it's easier for, say, a boss to spawn and we have to do 12 damage to it or 15 damage to it if one investigator who's dedicated all of their deck to dealing damage, they can just unload on that boss. Whereas everyone else is cobbling together, well, here's the 4 or 5 points I'm going to get. How am I going to do that? That can be much more difficult than just saying, that guy, he can do it. Now, on the flip side, more flexible investigators can allow for greater map coverage and for round variance. So in, say, 3 or 4 player, it is very possible that everyone actually draws an enemy. It doesn't happen that often. In some scenarios where there's a lot of enemies, it can. And if everyone is just specializing, can all 4 investigators take their turns without worrying about those enemies, blocking what the clue getters are doing? That's a very tough thing to worry about if you don't have some amount of versatility in your investigators to deal with that kind of problem. As far as map coverage goes, I mentioned this a bit earlier, it's really inefficient for investigators to all move together from one location to a next. You have to do this in solo. There's no choice in the matter. But it's really good in a 2 or 3 or 4 player game that one person goes off to one location and deals with that entire location themselves. They can get all the clues there and then move away. That's 2 move actions that you're saving every other investigator from having to follow them. Even true of, for example, they go off and then draw an enemy. If they can evade the enemy and then come back, then that's great. You have saved up more actions for other investigators having to avoid taking action to move in, fighting, taking action to come back. So there is something very nice about having more flexible investigators. But I think there's always this discussion of, should I run a more flex investigator or, my main fighter or whatever? How do I do this in multiple players on a team? I think this is more of a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have someone who's focused, and I've talked about this before, that you can overcome this player count scaling for the whole team very, very well. That's a specialist. They can be really good at fighting, they can be really good at getting clues, whatever it might be, that they are counting on their deck performing, and they are pretty much guaranteeing that they can. On the other end, there's people who are more flexible. They can overcome any of the challenges that might come up, even unexpected ones. And I think this is an important point, that sometimes when we are so focused in our deck building and say, I am going to fight every monster that shows up, there might be something else that the scenario throws at you, because they know, the designers of the scenarios, they know that you're bringing some, overpowered whatever deck that can do this. They want to challenge you. The designers want to say, you have all the best weapons in the game, but guess what? You can't actually defeat this enemy. Or in order to defeat them, they have to only take 1 damage at a time. Something that might be a little bit off the wall or unexpected. And a more flexible investigator can pitch in maybe surprising ways, whether it's just passing random scenario tests because they have more icons in their deck that can let them pass all kinds of different things, or if it's just something where, say, every investigator is now engaged with an enemy, or every investigator needs to get a clue, then they actually are more valuable than you would have thought otherwise. Right in the middle, though, is an investigator that might have a defined role but can contribute outside of it. What I mean by this is that 100% of your deck doesn't have to be geared towards fighting. It can be 75%. It could be 80%. Whatever the number is, you have a few things in there that can help you do something else, either during downtime or just because the scenario calls for something different. And personally, I like to have something in many of my investigators for contributing outside my role. But it doesn't mean that I don't have some main goal of the deck that has that defined role. I'm not saying that you don't do that thing most of the time. What percentage is most of the time is kind of up to you, but it just means that I don't reject any other things that pop up as being not my job. It's just maybe not my main focus. I might not have an answer for it right now, but I'm not worried about it if and when it does come up. So think about flexibility versus focusing on your role as being part of a spectrum. Now, what your role is separate from this. So it's easier to build a deck once you know what your role is on the team. And we'll talk about what those roles are in a second. But roles aren't necessarily tied to investigator class, especially with the whole card pool. But I think this was still true in the early card pool. It's just much easier with a lot of different card choices. So don't think of these roles as Guardian, Seeker, Rogue, Mystic, or Survivor. Although a lot of those classes lend themselves a bit more to these roles, you can make up the different, the math, the thresholds of getting clues, dealing with enemies in basically every class. I will say that larger player counts can take advantage of more specialist investigators pretty well, but it's also nice to mix them with more flexible ones, start to mix up the roles a bit more, and I think it's also a bit more fun to play this way. Again, all of this is here to inform deck building, because then you'll know what kinds of cards I need to include, and maybe even which investigator I want to pick. The order in which you do this really is player group to player group. Some people say, I want to play this investigator, and then they figure out what their role is. Sometimes they are told this is the role you need to do, and then you go find an investigator that they think would be fun for that particular role. But it's really kind of a collaborative process in my experience about figuring out who and what you're going to play. So let's give the different roles kind of some big names. So the first one is enemy management. Often people call this just the fighter. Your role is to remove enemies as an obstacle for other players as much as possible. Again, the classic conundrum is everyone drew an enemy. Uh-oh, what do we do? Whoever is responsible for enemy management should say, don't worry, I'll handle this, right? You don't want the other players to lose their turns or actions because you didn't know how to get rid of the enemies. But I'm being very cagey about how you do this. There's lots of ways. Mostly it's through dealing damage and defeating enemies, and you should have that because if you're going to be dealing with enemy management, you need to have an answer for elite enemies and enemies with victory points, both of which need to be defeated in the normal conventional way. Or cards that just say defeat the enemy. There are plenty of those too. Evasion may or may not be an important tool. Kind of depends on your investigator or your build. In a higher player count, I think evasion is important to just have somewhere on the team, especially with bosses. You want a way to not just die being engaged with a boss for multiple rounds. So keep that in your back pocket too. But sometimes the classic investigators who are involved with enemy management are not the best for evading. They might need some other cards that help them do that. Next up is getting clues. Clue collection is a very important role. These are lovingly called cluevers. Your role is just to progress the game by discovering clues as fast as you can. Again, the faster you can do this, the fewer encounter cards the team will draw, and that's better for everyone. Lots of ways to get clues these days. Is it the basic investigate? That's pretty good. It's better than any other basic action, and you should make up the number of clues that you need to get pretty well. You do need to get your number big enough to do basic investigates. Most seekers have a big enough number, but there's assets in play you can get that help that number go up even more. Other ways to do it, though, you can play spells, you can play other assets to discover clues themselves, events that might discover clues, but you do need to get quite a few. If you're really taking on this role, you don't need to get every clue on the board, but you probably need to get more than the player amount per round. At least try for that at some point. You can go back to some of those numbers earlier. You don't need to do that every round. There's plenty of rounds you might get no clues, but you probably should be, if you think about a location that has one clue per investigator. If you're playing solo, obviously you get all the clues, right? So pretend that in 2-player, you're kind of doing 2 persons worth of clue getting because you're going to get more clues than the other person. Hopefully, I mean, it could just be that you split evenly, but that's unlikely. But hopefully you can get 2 clues off that location relatively quickly. In 3-player and 4-player, you don't need to do quite as much. Some investigators will just try to get every clue, but let's just say there's 3 clues on a location. In 3-player, you should probably get 2 and leave the other one for someone else. Or maybe you get all 3, but then you don't go to some of the other locations on the table because other people went there and could get those clues off, maybe slowly, but they could get them. I also point out here that a lot of clue getters have evasion as part of their kit because it allows you to wander off alone and pick up clues quickly. Again, it's very slow if you move around and have to get the fighter to move after you and kill something that you drew. But if you can just take an evasion test and then keep moving, it speeds up the pace of the game much more quickly, and the fighter can catch up with the enemy sometime later once it's moved into another location. Now, the last role I have here is the support role. And your role is to amplify and protect the other roles. And there's a lot of ways you can do this, but I would say that the support role can also fill holes in other decks. If you're not getting as many clues from the main clue getter, then probably you can get a few through various ways. If you're not able to kill as many enemies as you really should be, maybe the support can help with that a little bit. But by and large, the support is going to involve ways of making the other decks just better. Holes in other decks could be things like, I don't have healing, I don't have enough soak, I don't have enough actions to do things. Well, this other investigator could say, look, I'll deal with those problems. Are there bad treacheries that people are going to draw? I've got the cancellation here. I will protect you from those bad things. Or you took a Rotting Remains test and you failed. You took some horror. That's okay. I will heal it, or I'll let you soak that horror onto my cards. A lot of different classes have ways of supporting. I think this is an undervalued part of the arsenal of cards that we have, and it can be kind of fun to do this. Now, remember, all of these different roles are still things you can combine, right? The idea of the flexible versus focused spectrum, right, is for all of these different roles. Someone who's very flexible could do all three of these things in some parts. So let's give an example of this with a team. This is a very classic one. This is a 3-player team, all investigators from the Path to Carcosa Investigator expansion. And we've got Mark Harrigan, Minty Fan, and Safina Rousseau. I'm not going to explain too much about what they do. You can kind of just look at their art and think about what they do. But this team, just based on the numbers, has a really nice balance of stat lines and of health and sanity, right? Min has 7-7 for health and sanity, and Mark Harrigan and Safina Rousseau have 5 and 9, kind of reversed. As far as the stats go on the top part of their card, we've got a 5 in combat for Mark Harrigan, so he's probably going to be doing a lot of fighting, but he's got a very large number that helps him do that. And the other numbers aren't too bad either. Now, Min has a high intellect score, relatively high, higher than the other two anyways, so she can fulfill the niche of getting clues. Safina has a very different kind of stat line, partly because she is part mystic, part rogue, so the 4 willpower and the 4 agility are really nice for her filling those needs, that she can use other cards that use agility and willpower in ways that the other 2 investigators can't quite as much. So there's also a nice spectrum of what each of these investigators can bring to the table. Mark and Safina can manage enemies in different ways. Mark generally by shooting them with a gun or using some other melee weapon. Safina can do some evasion or event tricks to deal with enemies and can do plenty of damage as well. Min and Safina can also get clues together. Min kind of has the traditional, I'm a seeker. I can get clues by doing basic investigates. Safina, not so much, but maybe she can use lockpicks. Maybe she can use some events. She can pick up her share as well. Lastly, looking at these 3 together, Mark and Min have something in common. They both have some element of support. Mark, it's the Guardian card pool. He's got a lot of ways to heal, not just himself, but other people, and hand out other kinds of support. Min, it's printed on her investigator card. She has an ability that after any investigator at her location commits a card to a skill test, it gets another icon, basically a wild icon. So that's something that scales per player count, which is really nice. So just her being around makes everyone else better. That's kind of a basic idea of what these 3 decks could do, but Mark could get some clues if Safina isn't doing it as much. There's lots of cards in the Guardian card pool that get clues, including in the core set. So he doesn't have to completely ignore getting clues if he feels like he's doing great on the other part of enemy management. Min could manage some enemies too if Safina isn't doing that as much. There are some secret cards that deal damage, so she's not helpless either. She also has off-class survivor, so there are some options that she can for dealing damage. The math just needs to add up at the end of deck building. And I feel like I haven't given you the secret number of here's exactly what you need to do for your each individual deck, because it is a collaborative effort. It is something that you just have to, you get a little bit more experience in the game, you can kind of feel it, but you need to make sure that there is enough juice in each of these decks that together they can do all the tasks that I've mentioned at the beginning of this scenario. You can't just roll up with any random Mark Harrigan deck and assume that it will work with the other 2 decks, because maybe it doesn't. Maybe it needs to do more damage. Maybe it's doing too much damage. And then Mark is sitting around wondering how he can contribute to the team. Maybe he needs to lean more into support because Safina has plenty of damage in her deck already. These are questions that you need to ask your team as you're figuring out how to build your investigators. And that's essentially where we're going next. Next video, we're going to look at the investigators themselves. I want to spend some time evaluating and understanding the investigator abilities. They all have something different to bring to the table, It's not just the abilities, it's also the stat line, the elder sign, the deck building on the back of their card, their signature cards as well. All of these roll together and kind of create the investigators for who they are. But I want to sit down and really think about, hey, what can these guys contribute and what makes them not necessarily good or bad, but what makes them uh, unique in how they inform the rest of the deck building of the investigator. In other words, what are those abilities, stat lines, etc., telling you to do with what you put into your deck? All right. Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate your support as always, and I hope you're looking forward to the rest of the videos in this series.